Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I'm very happy to have Annelies Van Assche as a guest tonight. Annelies, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So I'm an academic. I'm a theater scholar, actually, dance scholar, and a sociologist, and I work at the university. So I prepared the conventional lecture on paper, which I'm going to read to you, but I'll try to do it in an activating way. And as you all know, I'm coming to talk about my recently published book, which is on the relationship between the precarious labor conditions and aesthetics, specifically in contemporary dance. But I think a lot of the findings you'll hear tonight are related to all the arts and to life in general. So here I go. So the roots of my engagement with the precarious labor conditions in the arts date back to 2010, when my professor at the time, which was Katarina Pevny, asked me at the end of my last oral exam at Ghent University if I would be interested in applying for a research project as a PhD candidate. But I had already arranged an internship in a choreographic center in Hamburg. So I told her I was very flattered and I was interested, but I desired to expand my work experience within the performing arts sector first. So away from all the paperbacks and hardcovers, I was ready to explore new territories and to delve into the brave new world of work. As a production assistant for the weekly professional training program and the residency program at the choreographic center in Hamburg, I often lend an ear to the many conversations among the contemporary dance artists in the communal kitchen during lunchtime. Those exchanges often dealt with how they were going to pay their rent at the end of the month, or whether someone knew someone who could look over the budget for the next project application. At the end of my internship in May 2011, I assisted with the organization of a symposium, which was curated by dance artist Angela Guerrero, and it was called Surviving Dance, Kunst, Wirtschaft und Politik. The event engaged artists, audiences, and institutions, and was intended to be a platform for a discussion of the working conditions in dance in the context of the completion of a funding program, Tanzplan Deutschland. So in other words, how would the dance sector survive without funding tethered to the art form itself? In the program booklet of the symposium, a quote was printed, and it was taken from a conversation between three dancers about their future working prospects. A conversation held in the preparation of the symposium. Expressing concern leading up to the event, one of the dancers said to the other, "I'm a dancer, hopefully I'll die before I retire." What is fascinating about this quote is the double and conflicting meaning it covers. The optimist and pessimist inside all of us would probably interpret it quite differently. For the optimist, the phrase refers to one's passion in work, to dance or work in dance until one drops dead, to not having to stop dancing because that's how one chooses to live. For the pessimists, however, the quote is a shocking statement that testifies to the grim reality that faces most project workers: the unpleasant prospect of a future without a decent pension due to the precarious nature of the project-based profession. After my first footsteps wandering into the brave new world of work, the pessimist in me returned from Hamburg in consternation. I was shaken by the precarious working conditions in the contemporary dance profession, but I was also curious. I wanted to dig deeper into the raised issues during the symposium and to explore not only the impact of the working conditions on the dance artists' lives, but also on the work they make. And that digging took some years. After roughly 3 years of working on and off at PARTS, the Brussels-based contemporary dance school founded by Anne-Theresa de Keersmaker, I returned to academia to conduct this research with the support of FWO. In doing so, I envisioned a more sociological approach to the matter stemming from an urge to engage more directly with the dance scene itself. After all, I'd been immersed in the dance scene for 4 years by that time. So this vision brought me to Rudy Laermans, who, as a professor in sociology, was also one of the main witnesses of the development of contemporary dance in Flanders, since the 1980s, that is. So he would therefore be the person par excellence to engage in such an interdisciplinary project with me. And so it began. Between 2014 and 2018, I conducted quantitative as well as longitudinal qualitative research in the contemporary dance scenes centered in Brussels and Berlin. And I approached that research as a dance scholar as well as a sociologist by focusing on the artist's experience of the particular working conditions, their working modes and processes, and the influence of these on the dance performances we see on stage. So this 4-year digging deep into the conditions of these two scenes ultimately resulted in the book publication I'm presenting today. And in that digging, I uncovered that, returning to the quote in the Symposium's program booklet here, both the pessimists and optimists were actually right at the same time. So let's start by clarifying a few things before I actually go into the findings of the research. So first, although I specifically inquired into contemporary dance, the majority of the findings can be generalized to the larger segment of performing artists who work autonomously on a project basis and who are not affiliated to one particular institution. Or I dare even say that some of the things can be generalized to any worker performing immaterial labor. Many of you, regardless what art discipline or other type of profession you might be engaged in, might recognize quite a few things I will be outlining tonight. Second, I prefer to speak of autonomously working artists rather than independent ones, since the vast majority remains dependent on a variety of institutions, ranging from funding bodies over to production houses and theater venues. So differently put, a career in the performing arts tends to develop between institutions rather than within one. So the competences and requirements to uphold such an inter-organizational career, they drift between dependent and independent work. And that is in fact already reflected in the different employment status that the profession of performing artist holds in Belgium and in Germany. In Belgium, the artist is an employee, and in Germany, the artist is self-employed. So without going too much into detail about numbers, it merits mention here that Belgium and Germany have quite distinctive freelancing systems in the performing arts sector. In Belgium, performing artists commonly work with short employment contracts, whereas in Germany they generally work self-employed. All in all, in the performing arts sector in Belgium, the term freelance work so relates to the project work legally framed with contracts with employers. Most artists manage these contracts via structurally funded institutions, such as alternative management bureaus, workspaces, payroll agencies, and so on. By contrast, performing artists working under the self-employed status are very rare in Flanders, but are most common in Berlin. As a consequence, in the Flemish and Brussels capital region, employers are obliged to follow the official wage scales of the collective labor agreement for performing arts, which grow according to one's seniority. While regulations for minimum standard fees do not really exist for performing artists in Germany. However, a recommendation for a minimum standard fee for freelance performing artists was composed in 2015 in Berlin, but it serves as a guideline for subsidy applications rather than a legal obligation, and it does not contain instructions to increase according to one's seniority or work experience. So I'm explaining all these boring numbers because this status within which project-based work happens actually impacts an artist's socioeconomic position with regard to their income and to their social security. Both countries have established social security schemes that specifically support artists, both of which in fact acknowledge that artists cannot be easily pigeonholed, neither as a conventional employee nor as a conventional self-employed worker. In Belgium, the widely debated artist status enables the application of the employee status in a freelance work regime. This status, which is not really a status, but rather a set of exceptions, comes with several employee benefits with regard to social security. But the coverage of periods of non-employment through steady unemployment allowances is probably the most important advantage because it creates a situation of stable income between short-term contracts. However, only 53% of the Brussels-based respondents in my survey had access to this crucial safety net, which means that it is relatively exclusive and very conditional. Dance artists with access are generally older and have more work experience, which is logical because it has to do with the specific requirements to acquire such a status, which is, for instance, the proof of sufficient income from artistic work specifically. In comparison, self-employed artists in Berlin can apply for membership of at the Artist Social Fund, Künstlersozialkasse, KSK, which coordinates the transfer of contributions to health insurance, pension insurance, and long-term care insurance. Especially health insurance in Germany as a self-employed person can be quite expensive. Just to give you an idea, it amounts to an average of 300 euros per month. The majority of my survey respondents are a member of the KSK, so it's less restricted than the artist status. But what does it really do? Members of the KSK only have to pay half of the contributions due to these insurance instances, and the KSK covers the rest. So while membership at the KSK may reduce the high costs of social security, this system does not really offer an unemployment allowances like the artist status does. In Germany, artists can apply for a quite rigid living wage known as Hartz IV. In terms of financial support for arts, both capitals have implemented quite a similar funding system, dominated by project-based subsidies for artists and structurally based subsidies for art institutions, and also for a relatively small number of dance companies, for instance. In terms of infrastructure, most project-based dance artists have come to rely on the transnational residency system, through which artists are mostly offered studio space for about 2 or 3 weeks. All this feeds into the difficulty of getting insight into the average incomes of the artists working in contemporary dance in these two cities. In both of them, the majority of respondents combine being a performer with other related main occupations, like choreographer or teacher. And they hold multiple jobs regularly. In Brussels, the median of average monthly income when calculating all different income streams lies between 1,000 and 1,250 euros net, as you can see on this comparison. Since Berlin respondents are predominantly self-employed freelancers, I had to ask them to estimate an average monthly income to take their average year income divided by 12. They indicated an average gross monthly income of all income streams between 750 and 1,000 euros. So since the Berlin-based respondents still need to pay rather high contributions to these insurances, and also they need to pay taxes, but seeing these numbers are quite meager, probably they will not need to pay a lot of taxes. We can say that Berlin data are actually quite lower incomes than the Brussels data. So when we're looking at all the paid working hours, the general meager incomes can actually be easily explained. In average, the respondents are only paid for roughly half of a regular work week. However, I also asked them to indicate all the working hours that are paid and unpaid. And those numbers are quite telling. 62% of the Berlin respondents indicate that they are paid for maximally half of their actual working hours. So that means half or less. In Brussels, this is true for 46% of the respondents. So that means that the estimated incomes indicated here are certainly meager, first of all, when compared to the number of actual working hours, and second of all, in the light of the reported high education level of these artists. So the survey I took definitely revealed one major issue in the dance profession, the absence of fair payment for all the delivered work. But what is all that work exactly? Unpacking what work goes into artistic work is what I tried to do in the book. And it was not an easy task, because in the arts and the cultural sector, labor and life are more often than not largely interwoven. The contemporary dance artists that I followed during my 2-year-long ethnographic fieldwork in Brussels and Berlin all share a comparable habitus in which work time and private life are closely intertwined, and sometimes even seem to depend on one another. What's more, the thick descriptions I offer in the book reveal that the studied artists value the relatively autonomous lifestyle that comes with project work, which makes them, at least partly, willing to lead a precarious but creative life. An informant describes the situation in Berlin as one of, and I quote, an extended youth in which freedom trumps income, end quote. A Brussels-based informant puts it quite aptly, I quote, I'm a lifestyle artist, and that is to me a huge form of remuneration. I'm not willing to sacrifice that for another career. So maybe I could have a different career where I make more money, but I wouldn't. End quote. The empirical findings of my research uncovered a tendency towards self-precarization, a concept coined by Isabelle Loret in 2006, referring to a certain willingness to sacrifice material benefits driven by a multifaceted immaterial income in exchange, such as the benefits of a relatively autonomous life dedicated to artistic preoccupations. So in other words, a voluntary adoption of relative poverty in exchange for an increase in autonomy and creativity. However, I wouldn't just call this phenomenon a Bohemian ethic, as some other scholars did, because the Bohemian implies the rejection of any economically driven behavior. While the qualitative findings confirm that artists often endure their working and living conditions out of a strong belief in their own autonomy and the value of self-realization, the fieldwork also reveals that self-promotion, multiple job holding, and self-management are an actual necessity to survive as an artist. As my interviews and the informants' logbooks that they held reveal, most informants in fact spend more time on these type of activities than on artistic ones. Nonetheless, the notion of Bohemian does apply in reference to self-precarization, testifying that the artists are to a certain extent willing to sacrifice material income for the sake of immaterial income. In other words, the values and motives for making art in contemporary neoliberal capitalism have remained the same as back in 19th century Bohemianism: artistic pleasure, temporal autonomy, lifelong learning prospects, a relatively free working environment, opportunities for self-development and self-realization, among other things. So in the book, I prefer to speak of a Bohemian work ethic, prevalent among the studied contemporary dance artists. This paradoxical concept can possibly be generalized as a habitus according to which most project-based workers, particularly artists and cultural producers, tend to act at the intersection of work, life, and art. It includes two oxymoronic notions: the choice for an autonomous lifestyle as an artist, but simultaneously the ambiguous acknowledgement that this comes hand in hand with actual work to ensure one's survival in the art world. So what does that art world look like? In Brussels and Berlin, at least, contemporary dance artists maneuver in an acceleratory society between projects and operate in a post-Fordist and neoliberal economy of work. What does all that mean? Social acceleration is a concept coined by sociologist Hartmut Rosa to describe how society accelerates. For example, and quite paradoxically, Technological acceleration logically ought to decrease the time needed to carry out everyday processes of production, of reproduction, of communication and transportation. But it seems to have caused an increase in the scarcity of time instead of slowing down the pace of life. Many people now feel hurried and under time pressure because we appear to do more things in less time. So instead of enjoying the increase in free time enabled by technological acceleration, we rather reduce breaks and do more things simultaneously, multitasking. In this overall context, post-Fordism describes a work regime grounded in flexible work formats and immaterial labor. Post-Fordism should be distinguished from neoliberalism, which researched in the 1970s alongside of post-Fordism and has since become the dominant guiding principle for economic thought and management, at least in Western society. Neoliberalism is also an ideology. It has become a hegemonic mode of discourse in political economic thinking, one that favors withdrawal from the state from many areas of social provision in favor of individual freedom and autonomy. Its impact on labor is very complex, but the neoliberal mode of governance is grounded in maximizing market liberty and entrepreneurial freedom through deregulation and through privatization. It basically restructures society according to the principle of the dynamic process of competition. In this outlined context, the process of artistic production is marked by working modes that can be described as fast, mobile, and flexible. In such an acceleratory work regime, artists are confronted, in particular, with chasing their own tails. This idiom suggests that contemporary dance artists individually undertake exhaustive and often also futile actions in order to create an artistic work, sometimes without making much progress. They are hustling. They're making their way as they travel from one place to another to chase after project funding and residencies. In this fast working mode, dance artists must manage a threefold chase: one after money, one after programmers, one after papers. In this chase, the mobility of contemporary dance artists in time and space becomes significant, especially considering the mechanism of the residency system on which most project-based contemporary dance artists have come to rely. It goes without saying that in such an acceleratory society and such a mobile work environment, contemporary dance artists are required to show constant flexibility, literally and figuratively, in various ways. In dance hubs like Berlin or Brussels, contemporary dance artists are dependent on public funding that finances their projects. This is probably not new for you. Funding can be direct, for example, through project subsidies that enable artists to have a working budget for a creation, or indirect, for example, through residencies that offer infrastructure for rehearsals, but sometimes they also offer technical support, lodging, meals, a working budget in the best case. Public subsidies for the performing arts mainly support the artist in the creation of artistic products, typically live performances. Project-based subsidies engender a precarious position that is not necessarily unattractive for artists, because it allows them to experiment and collaborate. However, even with the extra support provided by workspaces, production houses, or alternative management bureaus, the situation remains precarious, because also the future of these institutions is guaranteed only in the short term. They also rely on 2 to 4 year structural funding, which is also temporarily. Project-based funding in the arts, therefore, engenders a precarious position where the artist is dependent on financial support that is temporary and conditional. So project-based work in the arts is always accompanied by precarity, especially since the artists invest time and work efforts and often also their own money applying for project funding without the guarantee that they will receive it at all. In order to receive financial support, artists must write funding applications in which they describe the concept behind their new project, their intentions, their working schedule, and the required budget. Already from the outset, when seeking funding, the question arises as to whether others will be interested at all in the proposal. So the sense of uncertainty when applying for funding is three-dimensional. You do not know if you will get the funding, you don't know how much money you will be granted, and exactly when that sum will arrive. If you are dependent on the subsidy system as part of your production process, you must put a great amount of mostly unremunerated work efforts into acquiring subsidies by looking for partners, looking for residencies, co-productions, programmers, and so on. Conversely, to avoid the funding system, an artist needs to be creative in finding money during the production process. And that may equally take a great amount of unremunerated work effort. So, as sociologist Hans Abing once put it, one can certainly speak of an exceptional economy of the arts, in which an arts professional has to look for money to be able to work, whereas a common person works in order to earn money. Furthermore, contemporary dance artists in Europe often rely on the most important form of indirect funding, which is, like I said, the residency system. In order to be able to work efficiently, even in the research phase, having a studio is essential. The studio is a place to focus on a project where one can avoid the personal professional confusion of the home office. While the residency system is a generous and highly welcomed form of indirect funding, offering free infrastructure, and in the best case, also accommodation, meals, and so on, several of the dance artists in my research have addressed many flaws. And those flaws can actually affect the production process. Some of these flaws can be generalized, others are linked to particular residency programs or spaces. Specific programs appear to have certain expectations that impede the promise of uninterrupted work, as well as the general research-oriented character of the residency. For instance, when they include obligations to show a work in progress, or when they only give limited access to the studio space because in the same evening, dance classes are programmed in the space. More general flaws in the residency system actually include the scattering of creation periods in the studio over time and space. This type of career management requires an insurmountable amount of organization and planning that leaves little time for research and experiment. A lack of spontaneity, shaped by the temporality of the residency system, is a further example of a major drawback. Most significantly, this general lack of time for creative work, now regulated in limited time blocks, may undermine the quality of dance pieces on the European stages, as the production process becomes fragmented. A variety of dance productions dependent on this regime are created in bits and pieces and sometimes remain only partly finished. That means that the institutional acknowledgement of how artists actually work is not always reflected in institutional behavior towards the artists. So it's becoming more obvious that in the performing arts, finding work often has less to do with searching and applying for jobs, but it has more to do with looking for funding and residencies on the one hand, and entertaining a broad professional network and corresponding possibilities for project-based collaboration on the other. So this chase after direct and indirect funding I've just described is combined with maintaining a network of professional contacts. In general, a career in contemporary dance therefore develops between organizations and requires networking skills, self-promotion abilities, and communication tactics to sustain it. Contemporary dance artists thus maneuver from institution to institution, and in doing so, they utilize and develop their social capital for exploiting work opportunities. This can be best understood in the context of Pierre Bourdieu's discourse on the different forms of capital. Already in the early 80s, sociologist and highly quoted Pierre Bourdieu distinguishes between three forms of capital that a person possesses, which are economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital. We'll just focus on social capital here, which is made up of social connections and institutionalized relationships, and it can be conditionally transformed into economic capital, monetary income. So someone's social capital always functions as symbolic capital also, which refers to their public recognition or their good reputation as professional and therefore genuine artists. Accumulating social capital mostly comes down to chasing gatekeepers. This is a vital part of the production process because these gatekeepers, they can offer you studio space, co-production budgets, the opportunity to present your creation, and so on. This particular chase comes hand in hand with what I call identity work, which requires skills and competences in personal branding. Networking becomes a type of extended courtship, especially with programmers from venues and residency spaces. It involves several communication tactics during the process of selling either a new project or an existing piece. In other words, striking up conversations, rubbing elbows, and writing hundreds and hundreds of emails. Unfortunately, not only do the endless networking attempts and self-promotion pitches often remain vain efforts, the time spent on these activities threatens to restrict the time available for experimentation in the studio. Overall, contemporary dance artists have to cope with the bureaucracy that comes hand in hand with autonomous work both before, during, and after the production process. The different transnational work economies dealt with during a production process cause manifold problems requiring paperwork. As a consequence of the bureaucratic freelancing systems that I have described only briefly in my introduction, the public funding systems dominated by project subsidies and also the transnational mobility caused by the residency system, the contemporary dance artists have to juggle a fair amount of that paperwork. This may lead to the colonization of artistic by non-artistic activities, both before, during, and after the production process. This situation does not occur, for instance, within dance companies where artistic collaboration between a dancer and a choreographer is organizationally purified from everything economic by transferring this impurity to a purely managerial body, as sociologist Rudy Laermans once wrote it quite gracefully. So contemporary dance artists, whose work is generally project-based, rarely experience this purification. And if they do at all come to this purification through, for instance, arrangements with production houses or workspaces, this purification remains only partial. Furthermore, within the economic domain, part of the non-artistic work is directly connected to the artistic work, such as the working on a production budget or scheduling your rehearsals. And that should be distinguished from the administrative and organizational burdens of the work environment due to its complexity and the transnational mobility in the neoliberal project-based work regime. For instance, applying for work permits abroad, dealing with issues such as unemployment allowances or taxes. So alarmingly, the resulting lack of time for creative, productive work in the studio puts a strain on the artistic work, engendering artistic limitations. So all in all, we seem to stumble upon the paradox of how more autonomy, in fact, produces more work. As theorist Bojana Kunst also points out in her seminal book, artistic work is, and I quote, at the core of the twisted ideological relationship between work and freedom. The work that comes across as the freest is the work that is completely fused with life. The work considered free is the kind whose level of dedication and intensity leaves no further room for life. End quote. So this brief outline reveals that the artist's creative process in the studio is only part of the puzzle of work. The micro-world of the studio is inextricably linked to the meso-world in which artists constantly maneuver between institutions, on which they are highly dependent, and the macro-world that provides the socio-economic and socio-political context that enables them to work professionally. This causes a very dispersed focus. The artist's process is fragmented in time, in place, and in content. In this acceleration society, many projects may also partly overlap, and that certainly doesn't simplify matters. So in the project-based contemporary dance field, creative work in the studio is therefore acutely affected by the inclusive production process that I've just described. The dispersed focus, timing, and location of the creative process may result in the realization of semi-finished pieces, which become refined and finalized only while they are on tour. That is, if they manage to go on tour at all after their premiere. I'm saying this as we encounter more disposable dance productions that disappear after their premiere. Something which has little to do with the artistic quality or public appeal of the work, but it is a systemic problem. This can be explained, in part, by the fact that the responsibility for disseminating a production too often rests on the artist's shoulder, and because project subsidies sponsor the creation of a production rather than its distribution. The distribution problem ties in with questions of sustainability. If the work is not seen by others, but it remains a mayfly, then what are we working for? Additionally, the lack of time available to experiment in the studio may also cause artists to remain in their comfort zones, rehashing former material into new pieces. It should be noted that the lack of consistent time in a consistent studio may also cause a decline in quality of the productions we see on stage, as a consequential rehashing may result in déjà vu. But most importantly, the fragmented work process may lead to the production of tactical, marketable, and adaptable pieces. When moving from residency to residency during the creative process, visions of large sets and ambitious props soon evaporate. Even the need for a different color dance floor can quickly become quite an organizational burden and an expensive endeavor. Additionally, the less people involved, the cheaper the creative process and performance become. So in precarious times, the choreographer therefore often decides to perform in the work itself. This reduces the labor costs during the process, and it reduces the performance fee, because the contemporary dance profession is grounded in living labor. However, this situation may impede the creative process because the external perspective and sole focus of the choreographer on the performer disappears when the choreographer becomes a post-Fordist multitasker. The preferred situation of being on the outside and paying oneself as a choreographer has simply become too expensive, which is also one of the reasons why we see so many solos on stage, which I dubbed precarity solos, inspired by the words of one of my informants. Conversely, artists may be inspired to develop work modes that require less rehearsal time in a studio, for example, establishing a creative process that does not require being together in a studio at all, or they might develop performances that are tethered to not being set in a black box. While it is alarming that the work regime threatens the quality of artistic products, what's even more worrying is that the many vain efforts involved in these chases may lead artists to burnout. Burnout is the final stage of a lengthy process called overburdening, especially prevalent in professions that involve what Sergio Bologna terms relational labor, and among people who are very involved with and exceptionally motivated by work. Commonly, burnout strikes people who start work with high expectations and drive that makes them vulnerable to disappointment. Contemporary dance artists generally match this description. In the described Bohemian work ethic, dance artists strive for enrichment instead of material richness, and this in the form of self-development. However, there often comes a point in these threefold chases that I have depicted here, when contemporary dance artists realize that they give more than they can take, which is quite reminiscent of Wile E. Coyote here, who never seems to get anywhere and who constantly fails to catch the roadrunner. In a similar vein, many dance artists and cultural and arts workers alike endure this situation, and they go on with working and living for too long, which in the book I have compared to Lauren Berlin's concept of slow death. An increasing number of people in the arts are wearing out, both physically and mentally. Slowly, the immaterial currencies may stop compensating for the lack of material income. In my fieldwork, most informants have signaled that they barely have time left to actually work on making art, and that they do not feel like an artist anymore. Nonetheless, at this very end, I need to stress that the contemporary dance performances, influenced by this fast, flexible, and mobile production process, are certainly not always affected by a decline in quality. In fact, some performances created in and inspired by these circumstances turn out to be very powerful, provocative, and ingenious works of art. All the dance productions that I discuss in the book are self-reflective performances that oftentimes use humor and irony as restorative and political activating devices, not only criticizing the conditions of their own production processes, but also subverting the apparently personal issues in ironic acts by making them public and adding a heightened sense of solidarity in the space. This proves that artists are indeed more than capable of producing high-quality art under precarious circumstances. However, that's quite a dangerous statement, because this realization may well be abused on the mesoeconomic or macroeconomic level, which should by all means be avoided. Herein lies the ultimate paradox, which remains unsolved at the very end of my lecture here tonight. If some of the best artworks were created in very precarious conditions, why should governments continue to subsidize the making of art? In fact, artists are very capable of producing high-quality work without sufficient means and in production processes scattered over time and space. Regrettably, governing bodies are, of course, aware of this strength. This very fact turns it into the artist's weakness, undermining the urgency to improve current conditions, at least from the perspective of governing bodies. So yet, and with this, I would like to conclude my lecture tonight. This is not and should never be an excuse to disregard and discredit all the work that goes into an artwork. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure that you have comments, questions, feedback, doubts, positive notes, maybe. The floor is now yours.
Sorry, Bernie. During your talk with your...
I think you can remove it because I can't hear you.
Oh, thank God. Thank you. So when you were talking to the dancers in Brussels and in Berlin, did you come across any contingencies that the dancers had found to protect themselves from such a precarious lifestyle?
Yes, I wrote a whole chapter on survival tactics. And yeah, there are a bunch of things. One that comes to mind, which I personally think that is a powerful approach to to survive or actually to be resilient to the conditions, is the barter system, which is a very old system of an alternative exchange economy, basically, in which artists show that they are also very generous in sharing means with other dance artists. So if there's, for instance, there was this one case, just to give you an anecdote, there was this one case where a dancer who was more established, who had much more work experience, had a free room in his apartment, and he decided to host a student dancer who could not afford rent, in exchange for that the student dancer would take care of his dog while he was on tour with his company. So these kind of things allowed this student dancer to live there, and he ended up living there for 10 years or so, not only during his studies. And in the same vein, there are many other examples of how this sort of alternative exchange economy is generated, and that, of course, leads us to the idea of, should we start some sort of commoning economy where we can kind of avoid the individualized trajectories but have a more collective trajectory or something like that.
The individualized trajectories, I find it's quite interesting with the dancing world or performing arts world, because they can't separate themselves from their artwork. Like, in essence, we can be horrible people but make nice art. And so there's different opportunities for us to be distanced from our work, where they have quite a lot of pressure to tie their social wealth in with their artistic possibilities. And does that prevent them from, well, what was I going to think? But like, there's something there, but it's like, does it prevent them from making certain decisions because they have to always brand themselves both in their work and in their daily life?
So if I understand you correctly, you're asking that, or you're saying that in a way it's for dance artists even more complicated to kind of separate life from work, because even in their social life they always have to kind of be careful what they're saying and doing, because there might be an opportunity somewhere in a conversation, while in your case you don't have so much trouble doing that.
I mean, there's still opportunities like in every conversation, but I think because you can't separate yourself at all, and you're always carrying the work that you potentially are making or have, does that make it? You don't agree at all?
No, well, I'm interested in dancers as artists. So I try to avoid the word artist because it's been totally eroded, especially in English, like countries that have English as the mother tongue. Everything is art in the US. So I'm interested in authorship. Mm-hmm. So at what point is a dancer an author? And at what point is a dancer an instrument? Mm. And yeah.
Yeah, in the case of my research, I focused on, like I said, autonomously working dance artists. I also specifically use the term dance artist and not dancer, because they have a multiple identity. They don't really have one occupational identity, in the sense that most of them author their own work, they create their own work, but sometimes there are occasions where they join a project of someone else, or even maybe temporarily engage in a company. But in contemporary dance, always the dancer, even if led by a choreographer, is also the author of the work, because in contemporary dance, which is already a contested notion, but let's look at it as a, it's hard to define as a style or something, but as a general idea of dance as an art form, let's say. Choreographers today mostly are more they give guidance, but the dancers really create the movement based on instructions, but not really based on, there are no pre-written instructions or something, pre-written movement sequences or something, but yeah. So authorship is a very contested notion in dance, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, so I refer always to dance artists to kind of fathom this comprehensive notion that one can be a choreographer at some time, and then you can be a dancer at some point, but you could also be a dramaturg at the same time, and sometimes you are both at the same time. Sometimes, like I said, a choreographer dances in his or her own work. So that's why I usually speak of dance artists.
Yeah, and that's when there is a sort of a co-authorship and a collective effort, as in all arts. Like an artwork is made by a person or a group of individuals, but it also starts to exist over again when it's looked at. So it's so culture in general is a collective exercise and practice, and that's why I'm very much interested in authorship, because for me that authorship means that you have the ability to grasp your you can take it the bull by the horns. You don't necessarily have to work within an institutionalized system. You can go out on the mare and you can dance, or you can recite a poem, or you can write on and I think this is very important in the neoliberal system. I think in a way a lot of the witnessing, or like the witnesses that you can assemble, they are symptomatic for that system. And I think for me the author's job is also to look for cracks and find a way out, and not to be domesticated from the start off, or like, you know, so for me part of the authorship is to also be critical about the platforms.
Exactly. Yeah. And in my research I came across a lot of more artists, including also the ones in my fieldwork, that were deliberately not working within the funding system, within you know, the conventional venues and all that stuff. So it's still like the cliche of Berlin being a more of an underground scene, a more the hub for experimental art or something. Was still true in my findings, at least. Yeah. Other thoughts? You.
Is that because funding applications put a pressure on the scope of freedom that artists can have over their own authorship of the work? Yeah,
I think funding, or at least project subsidies, kind of copy the idea of neoliberalism and structure the whole community into, or according to competition, you know, and you have to formulate what you want to do in a way that convinces the jury. So you have to already kind of master some sort of tactical language to formulate what you want to do as an artist, so that you will get the money. So in a way, if you want to receive the funding, you already have to kind of, you know, change your words, in the end, that's like already one way. There's always only one author of the funding applications as well. So let's say you're a choreographer and you want to make work with 4 dancers, mostly people you already know. You already invited them to join your work, but it's your idea, but you will work on this as a collective. But you are writing the project subsidy application because you're taking the responsibility of writing that. Maybe also because you cannot pay your dancers to co-write the subsidy application for you, because as a choreographer, you want to be able to pay your dancers. And maybe in other cases, when you are the dancer for another choreographer, you would also want to be paid for all that work. So the choreographer who invites 4 dancers decides, okay, I will write the project application. It's my idea, but we will work on the material together, and we want to have this kind of horizontal decision-making process in the studio. But in the end, you wrote the application. You're also doing the marketing. You're also doing the branding. You're also talking to the programmers. So in the end, there's always this kind of this feeling. You want to have this communal feeling, like we made this together, and maybe it's credited also as such on the poster, but in the end there's always this feeling, but I as a choreographer, I put a lot more work in it because I did all the networking. And so, yeah, these are issues that are very, well debated within the community itself. Because also these it's also hard to kind of avoid. I mean, you can avoid the system, but if you avoid project subsidy systems and you want to make the work on your own terms, then you're also kind of abiding by the neoliberal idea, because then you're exploiting yourself as well, and you're doing it on your own terms, and you're becoming your own entrepreneur, investing your own money in the thing, and that's also neoliberalism. So either way, you're kind of stuck in this cycle.
And with projects being temporary, but also the bodies that give funding to the projects being temporary, and the institutions themselves having to rely on these very temporary frames of funding, I imagine they come with quite a lot of conditions of funding. Otherwise, they would just have a long-term funding. Do you know what I mean? Like, if they're doing such short-term funding, then that's it's a tight leash that they're giving. So, do you feel like that sort of funnels trends or specific ideas, like attachments with the funding, and maybe funnels certain applications further depending on whether they meet the criteria of a specific trend?
Yeah, you can see there's always agendas somehow. I remember one of the informants in my research saying, like, there was a time for a year or two that you just had to name Deleuze and Guattari in your project and you would get it. So yeah, at the time of my research in Berlin, which was 2016 and 17, it was all about feminism. So yeah, because of the networking, people kind of get an idea, okay, I know what I have to focus in order to get the funding. But it's not just in what you write. Like I said, it's also a lot in who you know and who you present yourself to and how you present yourself to those people. So building your social capital.
And the networking gives you an idea of what is currently hot or like interesting for a lot of people at the moment. So people tend to, like you said, they look for money before they work. Is it also the case that they look for what's flowing like in the circuit at the moment before they create?
Not so much, I think. No, I don't think so. It's mostly the networking. Yes, you can get ideas about trends and stuff, but I think what it mostly does is a lot of the art is judged on who you are and not what your work contains lately. So sometimes just by reading your name, this is kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy idea, right? So a subsidy commission, just by reading your name, would read that proposal maybe differently than an equally written good proposal, an equally well-written proposal by someone whose name they've never come across and they've never met in the foyer of a venue or something. So that's yeah, that's why it's so important to show yourself and talk to people and, yeah, kind of sell yourself. And that's also what you asked before, like when you're meeting other artists in your community, not only professionally, but on a friendly basis, you kind of always have to think about future possibilities, which is very exhausting, I think. I mean, I'm telling it now in extremes. Of course, it's not all bad. But yeah, it's just to give an idea of a lot of students from Parts. I've worked at Parts before. I did this research for 3 years. And I noticed that a lot of the students graduating, and they stayed in Brussels because a lot of students are international students, but they stayed in Brussels because it's a good place to be. There's lots of funding opportunities. So they stayed and they tried because they'd already built up a network because of going to that school. And after 2 or 3 years, I still knew them, and they came to me and they're all like, I feel like such a fraud. I'm constantly trying to sell my work. I don't want to be doing that. I just want to make it, you know? And they were very disappointed because no one had told them about these conditions of how the market kind of works, because it's also a market, right? So that's also why I did this research. I just want to inform people that's how it goes, but when you understand the mechanisms, you kind of, that's a starting point for forming, you know, finding ways to subvert them or to at least manipulate them from within or something. So yeah.
Well, I'm curious then, because Parts, of course, is a schooling system, a schooling platform. Would it be advisable that schooling platforms try to give an as broad vision of possibilities, of strategies and tactics? Because like this school, of course, delivers future makers who like the painting department has a lot of reaction at this moment, which means that people think, we have to go to that school, you know, and I would think it's important that the school tries to give an overview of possible positions and not just always underline and highlight the one that is thought of as the most successful through the eyes of society, and that's why I think, that art has a lot of potential with hooks, nooks, and crannies that aren't investigated yet, and especially not by the mainstream. And would it be advisable for schooling to put a lot of effort in broadening the platform?
Yes, but I think first they need to provide preparatory courses to kind of ease students into the brave new world of work, in the sense that a lot of art schools, but also I work in the Department of Art History, Musicology, and Theater Studies, and there are really not a lot of courses that address things that we are going to need in the world of work, such as, for a long time, I think we now have it for 2 years, but for a long time there was not even one class dedicated to how does, or what does a subsidy application look like, and how shall we deal with it? How do we fill it out? So I think it's crucial that at least there is at least one course, let's call it cultural management, that addresses everything you need to know of what the actual working world looks like in the arts, and then you can continue to, and let's look for alternative paths and tactics. Yeah.
It's also a paradox in your book that you mentioned that mostly the subsidies are granted to artists who already have a quite nice career, so they don't really need it anymore. So how can students cope with that problem? Yeah,
that's a bit a problem of granting project subsidies. Because of course it's logical that that most of the money goes to the most well-written applications, and when you're well practiced, then of course you get the money, and when you have a high social capital, then you're more likely to get the money. I think the problem is much bigger in Berlin than in Brussels, in the sense that at least in Belgium we have structural subsidies, and most dance artists who have quite a lot of work experience and who manage quite well, they can start a Visitwe, an organization, and you could possibly apply for structural subsidies, which are longer than project subsidies. They're 2 to 4 years. In Berlin, this was not the case. Everyone, if you're established or emerging, everyone applies for project subsidies. And the problem at that point was that Sascha Waltz, who's the Anne-Therese Keersmaker of Berlin, she got almost half of the whole pot. Because she doesn't have a company that gets structural subsidies. So now that problem is solved. Because of lobbying from artists, they started a kind of a working group that really evolved into a roundtable discussion that led into one of the results of their action was that, okay, so we'll make a possibility for structural funding for dance organizations, companies that have proven themselves, that they can work, that they will offer decent work. So I think, well, that's one thing. The paradox was also visible in who gets the artist status and who doesn't, because the problem with the artist status is it's a big advantage. And first of all, I think it's not fair that only artists can get the artist status, because there's a lot of freelance workers who might deserve the artist status, or a similar status at least. But the problem is that this status is not attainable for emerging artists, and they need it the most. So maybe it's an idea to look at it of, okay, let's give it only to emerging artists, or let's at least make the criteria for obtaining such an advantage, make exceptions for emerging artists. And with emerging, I don't mean young artists necessarily, but I mean people at the start of their career, or people who just came from another country and decided they want to reside in Belgium and become an art worker. For the first 2 years or something, and then you get 2 years when you work on this unemployment allowances, which I would not like to call unemployment allowances anymore, because you're definitely working at that point. But then you need to prove yourself after those 2 years that you can do it, but you've been given the opportunity to prove yourself at least. Yeah, something like that. But Hans Abin, who I quoted in the lecture, also he says, well, actually subsidies are the reason why there are so many poor artists. Because the more subsidies a country has, the more artists will try to get a part of that pot. And the problem is also that, well, the decision-making jury usually tries to give everybody just a little bit, but not enough. Nobody gets ever what they asked for, so they just give everybody a little bit less than they asked for, and then the problem is that artists are happy that they received it and they do it anyway. Let's try it with less means. So that's why Hans Abin says, so actually the whole subsidy system is the cause for poverty in the arts.
Interesting to look at it from that way also.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did our Flemish government also approach you, give us a copy or 100 copies of your book, because we really need to inform ourselves?
No, I tried to approach them. But yeah, recently I was, or maybe you don't know, there's a lot going on about the reform of the artist status and also the arts decree in general. But I was in a working session, and there some people who had quite a high position in the decision-making parties there, they asked for a copy of my book, so now they have it. But it took them a while.
What's considered an artist?
Well, jeez.
I mean, for the artist status, huh? For the artist status.
Okay.
Whoa, back off. Because I heard for the artist status also that you need to make like 30,000 euros a year or something as an artist or something. Is that not true? Is it 10,000, 20,000? 20, okay.
Well, I'll repeat it in the micro. She was saying that she heard that they are trying, there's discussions now of changing the artist status so that it's easier to get and not as easy to lose, right? Yes, there's discussions going on. There's specific requirements you need to, tick the boxes. I'm not going to repeat all of them, but yeah, a specific amount of income you need to prove over the course of a specific amount of days. So you need to actually prove that you've made money out of artistic work alone over a certain period of time, basically. But for instance, one of the big problems, at least in dance, is that a lot of the pedagogical tasks, so if a dancer or a dance artist is teaching a class for, let's say, 3 weeks, and that class ends up being a performance, but in a school context, that doesn't count, which is not right, because you need to have, you need to be an artist to be able to teach that, so it's strange. But yes, there's discussions going on that the status will be changed, and I'm involved in the discussions, but a lot of artists are involved in trying to lobby for what the best interest is. But I'm not sure if it will be, I hope it will be simplified, and I hope it will be, because yes, you have to, you're being controlled basically every year to see if you still meet the requirements. But it's a privilege to have that status, so somehow there needs to be still an incentive to that you can show that you have worked sufficiently under a decent contract in order to keep that status. And anyway, it's like I said, and it's a privilege to have it as an artist, but there are so many other freelancers who might deserve such a status because they work similarly. And maybe not even only freelancers, but anyone who works project-based, I guess. Yeah.
And it still doesn't deal with the problem that they only get half their, they only get paid for half their work.
No, that doesn't deal. No, that's something that should be dealt with institutionally, which is an ongoing discussion, and in the sector for sure. That institutions. I mean, there's lots of tools now available. Like there's this tool called Right is Right for institutions to. And also for artists to lobby for their own rights, but also for institutions to always think about, okay, we need fair payment for all the work. We need to make sure that everything happens fairly, but this needs to be translated into institutional behavior, but also you need to lobby for that yourself as well, as an artist. But there's lots of tools available now. It's a discussion that's been going on now for a couple of years, and they're trying to improve at least that fair practice in the arts. There are lots of charters you can sign. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I was very happy to see live people and to be on location. It's like a milestone for the last year, I think.